Greetings and salutations. Sometimes your greatest enemy comes in the smallest of forms, Hawk Watchers. In April, a sobering and frightening report was submitted to the United Nations Inspector General. The report laid out the threat posed to humanity by drug-resistant diseases, or superbugs, as they're commonly called. Entitled No Time to Wait, the report stated that antimicrobial resistance is a global crisis that threatens a century of progress in health, and that unless the world acts urgently, antimicrobial resistance will have a disastrous impact within a generation. And when they say within a generation, my friends, they are not playing around. The report estimates that if we, as in all of us, humankind, everybody, do not make radical changes and focus on fighting this threat, these drug-resistant diseases could kill roughly 10 million people a year by 2050. A year. That's only 31 years from now. And just like mom jeans in the Dynasty reboot, what was once old has now come back to haunt us again, because it seems that what's true in pop culture is true in superbugs as well. Tuberculosis. Yes, tuberculosis, as in Doc Holliday, Red Dead Redemption, that tuberculosis, has now hatched a strain that is drug-resistant. Nicknamed Ebola with wings, given that TB can spread through the air by the simplest of coughs from an infected person. It's estimated that in just the year 2017, this drug-resistant TB killed roughly 230,000 people. Much like climate change, this isn't a threat to our present, and future that can be ignored while we hyper-focus on things like Russiagate or building a great wall along our southern border. These are real threats that we can no longer ignore, pretend don't exist, or play the blame game over. You see, it's time to put aside the petty political garbage and strive to be the brilliant that we can be when we work together to stop this threat. Now let's start watching the Hawks.
If you want to know what's going on in your city, in your streets, never back down like Tyrell, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Sean Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabitha, Miss Wallace, with the wisdom and the pearl. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world?
Watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks. Listen when they talk.
Welcome everyone to Watching the Hawks. I am Tyrell Ventura.
And I'm Tabitha Wallace. And I, at last check, don't have TB. Thankfully.
Thank goodness. This is real. This report is truly sobering when you look at the numbers and you see how many people are dying from these, antibiotic-resistant, diseases and viruses, and now TB making a comeback. For all those who don't really know TB, like I said, it's what Val Kilmer had in Tombstone.
Yeah,
it's
you
not
sometimes
fun.
call it consumption.
Yeah,
artistically, it's when you always hear about characters like, oh, she was amazing and she died of consumption. That's what it is, because your lungs are filled with fluid and you're consumed by it and then you die. It's terrible. I think one of we've been told for a long time that this, shoving ourselves full of these super more powerful antibiotics is much like painkillers. The companies just kept coming out with stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger antibiotics.
Yes.
That's not good.
No, and you're exactly right, Tab. It does. This comes from our overuse of antibiotics in everything, because everything's antibiotic. Remember, it's everywhere you go, ooh, antibiotic soap, antibiotic this. Yes.
Yeah.
The UN report states that misuse and overuse of existing antimicrobials in humans, animals, and plants are accelerating the development and spread of antimicrobial resistance. Because, yes, we also shoot all our food up with it as well before it even gets to our dinner plates. Right. These are all those things that create these superbugs.
And that's what we're talking about. We also have, you're finding it in water and all of that. Like you said, you're putting it in our food, and then we're literally taking it. And then we need stronger ones to combat whatever it is. Also, I think it's a matter of we've all been taking antibiotics for the wrong things, and doctors are more than happy to hand them out when you're like, oh, well, I have this, I have this, I have this, I have a cold. It's like, keep taking them and keep taking them, and that's not helping.
Yes.
But that's a symptom of capitalism, really.
Yeah.
Our pharmaceutical problems, we wouldn't have this if it weren't for capitalism, because nobody would be out there making and trying to push something that ultimately I mean, you don't want it to actually be popular.
No, that's the cool catch with this.
Yeah, so that's the thing. So one of the things that a lot of people are starting to say is that we need to stop treating antibiotics as if they're just like any other product.
Yep.
So looking at it, you know, it doesn't work in a free market. It's not how it's supposed to work. So their value right now is determined by the number of units sold. Kevin Outerson, a Boston University professor who specializes in antibiotic resistance, told Vox, "This is a product where we want to sell as little as possible. The ideal would be an amazing antibiotic that just sits on the shelf for decades, waiting for when we need it. That's great for public health, but it's a freaking disaster for a company." And that's it. If it's not profitable, they don't do it, which is why our pharmaceutical companies, these things there are certain things that just should not be for profit.
I couldn't agree more. These things should be treated almost a little bit like infrastructure, like a government, definitely a government entity where you have, especially antibiotics, because they're so important to us. Mm-hmm. And like we say, the more we use them, the more the drugs evolve, or the more the viruses evolve,
they get stronger,
get resistant, and that's the problem we're facing. Yeah. But there's hope if we decide to put a little money behind it.
Yeah.
And when I say a little, a lot of money, but when you hear it in context, it's okay. Mm-hmm. For the United States alone, the total cost to fix the kind of broken system that we have now would be around $1.5 to $2 billion per year, according to Outerson, who you just quoted. Mm-hmm. That's the equivalent to what we spend on toilet paper every few months. Just to kind of put it into context.
It's not really a huge amount when you think about it in a whole economy and in a whole thing.
Exactly. Improving antibiotic stewardship is another thing, especially in animal agriculture. That's another one that the report pointed out. And then the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services proposed a policy more than 2 years ago to require antibiotic stewardship programs, teaching people how to properly prescribe, when to prescribe, why to prescribe, and when not to use, and things like that. Little things we can do to hopefully keep us all from creating a super bug that ends up killing 10 million people a year by 2050.
Yeah, because, we've had these before. They're called plagues.
Yeah. Don't want
that. No. Over 2,000 journalists and staff of major digital media organizations have been laid off or let go since the beginning of 2019, and it shows little signs of slowing. So what's causing this labor bloodbath? Well, firebrand Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted in January, "The biggest threats to journalism right now are tech monopolies and a concentration of ownership. Without a wide range of independent outlets and the revenue to sustain them, our democracy will continue to crumble." This week, Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes went on a full-fledged media tour to say it's time to break up Facebook for the same reasons. And in the case of digital news sites like Vice, Vox, Mashable, Gawker, and Light, their value was based on their ability to exploit Facebook and Google to reach larger audiences. In turn, they sold their companies on the premise that Facebook and Google needed their content. Turns out they didn't, which is why Disney, who invested heavily into Vice Media just a few years ago at a more than $5 billion valuation, is now racking up losses on the hipster news group. According to Disney's recent earnings report, the mouse saw a $353 million loss on the heels of another $157 million loss late last year. Vice, however, is not an outlier, as a few years ago, a small group of so-called independent news outlets with massive funding and sky-high valuations started getting bought up and started buying up even smaller outlets in an attempt to be media giants themselves. Now, while journalists are chucked out like day-old bread, investors are starting to realize that trying to buy into big media will leave them sold out to debt collectors, leaving news consumers with less options, journalists with less freedom, and the very checks and balances we need in the loss column.
Ooh, I was shocked when I saw this today when they said that, Vice is, like when Disney basically said, yeah, it was a worthless investment.
We can't figure out how to, it's not worth anything. And they'll argue about it like, oh, it means this. I'm like, do you make money? No. Do you lose money every year? Yes. Do you see a time in the next 10 years when you'll be profitable? No. Then you don't. You're not. What are you worth?
Not. What was it? $5 billion of evaluation.
Yeah,
Or valuation. That's insane.
Anybody who saw the first .com bubble should sort of would laugh at this because these valuations are exactly what happened. This is what happened with a bunch of tech companies that you were like, oh, it's going to be worth like $1 billion, and we're going to buy all this, and then nothing happened. They all just kind of. So Vice responded in a very Vice-like way. Stating, as the media industry consolidates and fewer players control the information and entertainment that the world consumes, Vice will always be there with a megaphone for the more than half of the people on this planet under the age of 30 who crave independent, world-class content.
Oh, yeah, they're super independent because it's those independent outlets that get interviews with, like, Barack Obama and stuff like that all the time.
They also just got $250 million more in debt, either it was debt or got more funding, essentially, from one of the, not to be conspiratorial, but George Soros and his companies just gave him $250 million. So indie.
So indie.
You're so indie and
Being
hipster.
owned by Disney is so indie.
I know. You're like literally owned by a bunch of companies.
Yeah. And you mentioned it in the toss too, Tab. It's when these companies suddenly decide to become, media conglomerates themselves,
Disney.
rather than focusing on like this is the one thing we do and we
Content
do this
creation.
best, right? Suddenly we got to branch out. I mean, look, the Vice Media Group consists of a global television station, a studio, digital, news, and an advertising agency.
Yeah, they have their own advertising agency.
I mean, that's ridiculously huge. If you're really all about, at the end of the day, reporting hardcore stories and hardcore journalism and doing it that way, focus on that. You don't need the other stuff. That's just greed.
Because they want to be like Disney. Well, we'll have everything. We'll do everything. Everybody will come to us. This is the hard part, but they're not the only ones because CNN is also having a little bit of issues of seeing job losses and restructuring there. According to The Hollywood Reporter, there was a round of buyouts, and CNN staffers are a little worried about what's next. The group also represents, there was a bunch of people who were given the chance of saying, hey, walk out and let's say, here's your big exit. Yeah. And they did, but the group, as it was said in the article, also represents a large number of the last employees who remember Ted Turner walking the halls of CNN Center and the sort of bread and butter of the network. People who are just CNN legends. Wow. So the people behind the scenes at CNN in these that were there when really built things up before it started this, let's figure out how many clicks and things. They kind of, that old guard that keeps track of things, that doesn't say that Juan Guaido won an election that never happened. That group that sort of used to be, that gave CNN the reason people looked to them because they were supposed to be that good, those people are leaving. Wow. So you see a huge restructuring when you see everything else cutting. They're cutting a lot of digital jobs, a lot of editors. But it's because, the whole Facebook thing, everybody's trying to make money on less people.
That's the thing, too, because, according to Reuters Institute Digital News Report in 2018 said social media usage is down 6 percentage points in the United States and is also down in the UK and France, which is due to a specific decline in the discovery, posting, and sharing of news on Facebook.
And that's what happens when you spend 2+ years arguing that Facebook has to do something and that it's this horrible place and there are memes and those memes could be wrong.
Oh my goodness.
I can't handle it. We'll, I guess, just have to try to get more megaphones here at Watching the Hawks.
All right, good one. As we go to break, Hawk Watchers, don't forget to let us know what you think of the topics we've covered on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And see our full shows at RT.com. Coming up, we look at the controversy surrounding a new medical procedure being tested on U.S. prisoners with Kim Wilson of Beyond Prisons podcast. Stay tuned to Watching the Hawks.
Dear viewer, thank you for finally changing the channel. I understand you're tired of networks that blur news with views. You're tired of commentary presented as fact and facts presented as commentary. They are not the same, no matter what the partisan hack want you to think. You know me. I'm famous for my views, and you'll get them. And the news. And me. Yours truly, Scotty Nell Hughes.
Do you know what you've got in your hand? You might think it's a phone, but in the news, we see it as TV. With Pluto TV, the free and unlimited TV app, you can get TV everywhere for free. And since TV is everywhere, so is RT. Streaming on all your favorite devices, outdoors or inside, any time of day or night. Catch all of our award-winning shows, news, and cutting-edge analysis everywhere you look and wherever you go. Question more.
As the great quote says, the degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. So what degree of civilization would we say the United States of America has when some of its prisoners are now set to be used as guinea pigs for modern corporate medicine? The Advocate is reporting that a pilot program for treating opioid addiction is now being tested on Louisiana prisoners using an implant that has not been approved by federal regulators. The device, which is surgically implanted in prisoners addicted to opioids, releases the well-known and widely used drug naltrexone. While naltrexone has been approved by the FDA in a daily pill form or monthly shot, there is no such approval for the drug to be administered through surgically implanted devices. While prison officials stress that the procedure will only be used on inmates who volunteer and are nearing their release date, many critics feel that the ethics issues at play here are shocking in the least and downright horrific at most. Joining us now to discuss this story and the ethics and history that surround it is co-host and producer of the Beyond Prisons podcast, Kim Wilson. Thank you for joining us, Kim.
Thanks for having me.
Kim, I already can hear, the arguments coming saying like, oh, hey, the inmates, they're volunteering, and given the severity of the opioid crisis, what is the harm in testing this device out on inmates? I mean, they're in there. They deserve it. Blah, 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 blah. What part of this story is missed by those making that kind of argument that it's okay to test non-FDA approved things on inmates?
Yeah. Well, I think I would probably say that it's not just testing things that are approved by the FDA, but testing on prisoners in general. That's part of the problem. But also taking a step back and asking a different question. Why are we using prisons as places or sites for treating people that have a medical condition such as addiction? So I think that, for me, those are the key features here. In terms of, this issue of consent and, prisoners are prisoners and they should be treated, or subject to whatever torturous mechanisms we can, devise for them while they're in prison. I think that that's also part of the problem. And I think that that's a core ethical issue that we have failed to really address and grapple with in this country. I think there's a long history of, prisoner testing or use of prisoners in medical and drug testing in this country that is pretty much covered up in the mainstream.
Well, that was my next question, is because this isn't, anyone who's a mild student of the U.S. prison system or prisons in general knows a lot of really bad stories. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that? These instances in the past from the American prison experience, or, in which they were used essentially as guinea pigs, having things tested on them. Can you tell us some of those?
Yeah, well, I can think of several different examples, but I'll just share a couple if we have time. The first one I'm thinking of is what happened at Stateville Prison in Illinois during World War II, where over 400 prisoners were purposely infected with the malaria virus. And that, experiment was framed in terms of, this is for the good of the country, that you're being a patriotic citizen if you're participating in this. And I think that that kind of framing and that narrative is part and parcel of what we're seeing today with the way that the opioid crisis or the proposed treatment and now actual treatment of prisoners in Louisiana is happening. right? So, so that's just one example. The other example that I can think of is what happened here in Pennsylvania, also around the same time. So again, during World War II, and this was also framed in terms of, helping the war effort. So a lot of people, or many of the prisons in Pennsylvania, had been, sites of different kinds of chemical testing. Dow Chemical had contracts with the prisons so that they could, conduct dioxin testing in the prisons on prisoners. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps had a program where they were doing mind control testing with prisoners in Pennsylvania. And this doesn't just implicate, prison staff and doctors and those folks, but it also, implicates institutions of higher education. In the case of Pennsylvania, there was a University of Pennsylvania professor who was, at the center of all of the testing that was happening. So you can see that, at least from those two examples, and there are more, that there's a history here that goes back very far. I think to expand this and, or broaden this beyond just what was happening in prisons is the notion of testing on vulnerable populations. And for that, we can cite the Tuskegee experiment, which was, 40-year plus experiment on black men in the South who were participants in a study on syphilis that went untreated. So, the idea was basically that, they could go to a doctor, but the doctors were required to not give them the treatment. And the only reason we know about that story is because, we had a whistleblower who in the 1970s was able to bring light or help shed light on this problem by, submitting his findings to a reporter at the Associated Press. And the article that came out of that basically helped shift the conversation in this country around medical testing in prisoners, and also the notion of things like informed consent, which, by the way, had been around from, it was established in 1957, but it wasn't, we didn't really give it any serious consideration until after the Tuskegee experiments came to light, 30, 40 plus years later in the 1970s.
Speaking of informed consent, I mean, I think that, look, prisons, the idea of prisons is that someone goes there to be reformed, not just kind of cataloged and locked away. The original idea, or what we all hope that we can get to that point, is like someone should go there to help reform and make them a better person, and then get them back out into society and things like that. Treating addiction among inmates, I think, is an important issue. What do you feel are better ways of handling this for prisoners in helping them, beat the disease of addiction and things like that while they're behind bars? What's a better way we can do this?
Well, like I said earlier, I think I'm very clear in the fact that I don't believe that people with addiction issues should be in prison. I think that that's a medical issue, and those folks need to be treated in different spaces, and not spaces that behave in the same way that prisons do, because we can set up hospitals and clinics that function and operate the same way that prisons operate, and that's not what I'm thinking of. But also, I think it's important to recognize, and the article that you mentioned talks about this, or at least they questioned a doctor who said that we already have a treatment that has been tested. We know that it works. It's called the gold standard. And that's the treatment that, if we're going to be doing anything with people in prison, we should, be offering. But again, this notion of consent is really a thorny business when we're talking about people who are living under coercive conditions. If you're living in coercive conditions, you cannot consent. So I think that we need to also have that conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the things we do know is that if you aren't in a position where you can freely make a decision about anything in your life, you can't be expected to make a decision about it under the way our prison system is. and all of that.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's such a great point to bring up because, yeah, it's like you guys say, it's you're in prison, you're a ward of the state at that point, like, and a lot of these people who would say, oh yeah, give me an implant, you know, we don't know if they are truly comfortable with this or if they're just saying it at the end of the day because, well, hey, the guy who's jailing me said I should. You know?
Yeah, we have laws about being under duress and not being able to make certain decisions.
I want to say thank you so much for coming on today and really shedding some good light on this issue of medical testing inside prisons. I think it's something that should definitely be looked at by society more. Thank you so much. Co-host and producer of Beyond Prison podcast, Kim Wilson. Always a pleasure having you on. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Just over a year ago, Parabon Nanolabs in Reston, Virginia received a DNA profile from the Seattle police. It was taken from the scene of the unsolved murder of 20-year-old police records clerk Susan Galvin in July of 1967. DNA and ancestry experts then ran the profile through a public DNA database for researchers, which led them to the grave of Frank Whippich, who died in 1987 from complications of diabetes. After exhuming his body, they were able to conclusively prove that Frank Whippich, a married former soldier, was the person responsible for Galvin's murder. The closing of the Galvin case marks the oldest cold case ever to be solved in the U.S. using DNA and ancestry databases. But it's just the beginning for police, who are now opening investigations into unsolved murders in places that Mr. Whippich lived, such as New York, Alaska, and Germany. And this week, DNA databases also helped solve a 47-year-old cold case in Indiana and a 37-year-old murder case in Nevada. Better living truly comes through science, giving voice to the dead.
That's incredible. That is incredible that they were able to solve that case after 50 some odd years. That's really, wow.
And possibly more in other places. There's a lot of truth that's going to come out with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of information.
I like that. All right, that is our show for you today. Remember, everyone, in this world, we are not told that we are loved enough, so I tell you all, I love you. I am Tyrell Ventura.
And I'm Tabitha Wallace.
Keep on watching all those hawks out there and have a great day and night, everybody.
Bye.